Okay, good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to our webinar on South Africa's electricity sector reform experience from emerging economies. I'm going to start. My name is Richard Bridle, and I'll be the moderator on today's webinar. I'm going to start with a few housekeeping announcements before we get to the content of the webinar today. So we're starting at 2 o'clock, and we're going to run until around 3:45 today. We'll certainly be done by 4, but we'll wrap up around 3:45. The structure of the webinar is that we're going to start with some opening remarks from speakers from the Department of Environment, Forestry and Fisheries, and also from Eskom, which will set the scene for the discussions today. We're going to have then 3 presentations looking at experiences from other countries, and also kind of a general one on the context in South Africa. At any time, and finally, we're going to have a panel discussion with some very distinguished South African speakers talking about the presentation today, or the presentations today, and also the other issues facing Eskom and the electricity sector in South Africa. So you can submit, as the participants, you can submit questions at any time through the webinar's Q&A function. So if you experiment with the interface, you'll see there's a chat and there's a Q&A. The Q&A will collect questions, and some of those questions we'll put to the panel at the end. Also, the panelists will, if there's a question of kind of where can I see that report or those kind of issues, then we'll try and answer them as we go. So feel free to answer questions at any time. You can also send questions through the chat if you need to, but try and keep the questions on the Q&A because that's very easy to keep track of whether they've been answered or not. We're also currently recording the webinar, and we'll post a recording after the webinar. If you follow Chido and I on Twitter, that's at Chido Mozondo or at Rich Bridle, then we'll tweet a link. You can also, I'm sure it'll also be up on the IISD or IISD website as well. If you have any questions about anything else, you can also send questions via the chat to the panelists, and we'll do our best to accommodate you, though it's difficult to respond to things when we're dealing with the webinar, so please bear with us. So first of all, an introduction to me. So my name's Richard Bridle. I'm an engineer, energy policy researcher, originally from the UK and based in Switzerland. I work for the International Institute for Sustainable Development, which is a not-for-profit that works on a whole range of environmental and sustainability related issues. And we work in the energy team, which focuses on just transition, electricity sector reform, subsidies, and many other topics. So what is the webinar about? The webinar is aiming to talk about how electricity sector reform in South Africa is similar or different to reforms that have happened in other countries. We're planning to give some international context to the discussions that are happening in South Africa. And we're also hoping to have some positive exchanges in the other directions as well with our Indian and Mexican speakers. So if it wasn't enough to talk about the challenges of electricity sector reform, we're also having this webinar in the context of a pandemic, which I'm sure some of the speakers will mention and may also have profound impacts on how the sector will develop. Combining all this, we hope we can have some positive discussions about how reform can take account of the context of the challenges of electricity sector reform in normal times, the specific challenges we face now, and we can feed into the ongoing reform debates in civil society and in government. So welcome everyone to the webinar, and I'll now turn over to Jonjikaya Witty from the South African Department of Environment, Forestry and Fisheries for some opening remarks. So Jonjikaya, the floor is yours.
Thanks, Richard, and also thanks to Chido for organizing and inviting us, the department, to present here and say a few words about a number of things that we are doing. Of course, our interest is looking at this from the lens of a just energy transition and also a transition to a low carbon economy and society. So thank you once again for that opportunity. I think the key question is on this particular topic is whether government has actually embraced the concept of a just energy transition. I think the answer to that is a resounding yes, because if you look at some of our key policy documents, there's an explicit reference to a just energy transition. If you look at the draft climate change bill that we have developed, we make provision for this aspect. You look at our national climate change adaptation strategy, and also very importantly, fairly recent work that is done by Treasury on the technical paper titled Financing a Sustainable Economy. There's an explicit reference to this particular idea. And also looking at the Department of Public Enterprises Eskom roadmap. So you can clearly see that there's a focus from dedicated from government to look at this problem, because it's integrated with other broader problems that as society we need to tackle. Also, if you look at other key policy responses, you will find a linkage to this, such as the integrated resource plan. And also one of the key important works that we are doing at the moment as government, which is the nationally determined contribution. We are currently reviewing that, and the manner in which we are reviewing it, we are looking at it through the lens of a just energy transition, because we recognize that the bulk of our emissions are actually related to the energy problem. So if we solve the energy problem, we'll be able to transition quite easy towards a lower carbon intensive economy. So this is an important topic for us. Of course, as government, we don't work in isolation. We have to work with broader stakeholders. So we've been having a lot of discussions with a wide range of stakeholders on this. And some of these have actually been arranged by Eskom, because Eskom recognized that there's a need to have an integrated approach in terms of tackling just energy transition. So we've been having discussions with NPR, UCT, CSIR, GIZ, who's actually leading a very crucial and supporting a very crucial element of this work, working with the government of Mpumalanga to ensure that there are talks and well-articulated plans on addressing the issue of a just energy transition. So we are excited with this work. And also we believe that it's timely because, as you will know, the department is currently developing a mitigation system which is aimed at addressing how we address climate change mitigation in the country. So again, energy is a key component of that. The National Planning Commission, as you would know, also led a very important work in terms of just transition pathways. So that work also links directly to this problem of just energy transition. And we were going to look at the next steps of setting a vision from which we were going to define a well-articulated mitigation pathways. Unfortunately, this has been delayed by the COVID-19 pandemic. So that's why we have not gotten into the work of defining the vision. But I think in the next couple of months, we will look at, again, starting this process because it's very important. But at the same time, this pandemic has given us time to reflect and think carefully about how we approach this, this problem. At this point, we also want to acknowledge the role that unions have played in this, because actually it is the unions that first highlighted the need for just energy transition as far back as 10 years ago. And that was instrumental for us when we started developing the National Climate Change Response Policy, because in that policy, there's a number of things that we are looking at. One of them is the National Employment Vulnerability Assessment, because we recognize that with an energy transition, there's likely to be effects on livelihoods, but also on job security. So it was important that we did that work. That work now has been done and will be consulted with a number of stakeholders. But also linked to that, we thought it's important to take a number of steps to show leadership in this way. So working with a number of stakeholders, we've also been developing what we call job resilience, sector job resilience plans, which are looking at key sectors of our economy, looking at coal, agriculture, tourism, petrol-based transport, and the metal industries. Because we recognize that part of the problem is sitting in these sectors. So if we have a focus on these sectors to think about what interventions we can put forward to facilitate the just transition in a manner that safeguards jobs, but also ensure that livelihoods are not severely impacted on that. The approach that we are following in doing that is a value chain approach, because we understand that these sectors that we're looking at are integrated, so there are knock-on effects across the economy. So it's important that we have an integrated solution instead of looking at particular sectors in isolation. So this is a very important aspect for us. Some of the key, in closing my remarks, some of the key lessons that we're observing for a just energy transition is that for one, we believe that large-scale systems should be a thing of the past, because they present the lock-in effects that make it difficult to manage such systems in the future. So we need to think of much more systems that are at a disaggregated scale, so that we can manage any future challenges that they present. Also, we believe that the designing and deployment of energy systems have to embrace all disciplines, from engineering to social sciences, because from what we're seeing now dealing with the transition, we are not only dealing with engineering problems, but we're also dealing with social problems, because the systems do not exist in isolation. People are affected by them. So the decisions that we take, we have to think about how they affect various aspects of societal living and also the economy. So that is very important. We also believe that an energy transition is imminent, whether we like it or not, because there are external forces that affect it. For example, we see globally there's divestment from fossil fuel. Renewable energy prices are going down, which makes it easy for us to deploy them. And there is, of course, accelerated investments in renewable energies. So this, and also economies in the future will demand trading, for example, with economies that demonstrate a transition to a lower carbon intensive economy. So hence we're saying this will happen whether we like it or not. So it is our responsibility to ensure that that energy transition is done in a just manner to ensure a sustainable future for South Africa. So with those few words, I would like to thank you very much and wish you all the best with this engagement. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, John Jakawa. Now I'd like to turn to Lwandle Makadi from Eskom. Are you still on the line? Yeah, if you can unmute yourself and start your video if you wish.
Okay. Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you very much for the invite. Most of the things that I wanted to touch on, I think Jongi has already touched on them. However, having said that, I'll still like you to take you, give you insights on what we are busy with at Eskom in this regard. Jongi has already basically told you about the I'm sure have seen, released by our shareholder, the Department of Public Enterprises, where they basically charted the way for the electricity reforms in South Africa. They basically outlined what they were expecting from the sector and specifically from Eskom, and they were very specific on what they expected Eskom to undertake as part of the reform. And in doing so, they were very particular in mentioning that they would want to see Eskom emerging after this, emerging from these reforms as they must be capable, transparent, accountable, be competitive, and be world-class in doing so. So already in the last few months, with the appointment of our new chief executive, and some of you have seen his engagements in the media, where he started explaining what is it that is happening within Eskom, from the restructuring, what a lot of you would call unbundling, and people within Eskom will call it divisionalization, which eventually would lead to a legal separation. There's a range of issues that have come up also in that context. And one of the key ones is around the issue around the cost reflective tariff, the issues around decarbonization. And in terms of our discussion today, I will focus on the decarbonization because that's where I come from. I come from the newly established project management office that has just been set up. That is actually part of all the discussions that Jongi has mentioned, from labor to implementation, and a lot of other stakeholders who are interested in Eskom transform and the sector as a whole getting reformed. So the project management office is basically responsible for the strategy and for a number of initiatives which are currently going on within the business. And maybe to give context in our discussion today, there are key policies, and whenever you talk around just transition, I think policy and regulation, Eskom is a highly regulated business, and I think the policy, as Jongi has alluded to this, has been one of the key drivers that Eskom is looking into. We've seen the National Development Plan being very specific on what is it that and how they define the just transition. The integrated resource last year has already charted a way, basically explaining what is it that they are expecting from the supply side to meet the expected demand. Of course, that now will need to take into consideration what COVID-19 will have, how that will have an impact on the implementation of the integrated resources plan. The issues around electricity pricing policy, I've mentioned that, around cost reflective tariff, that will be very important as we move forward in the role of the regulator in that regard as you bring in more generators into the space. Of course, all the climate change policies and initiatives and activities that Jongi and the team are busy with at DEF, they are key in driving the process internally. We still have our National Energy Act of 2008, and I must mention the pricing policy. It will be very interesting what comes out of this and how we tackle it in our discussion. Disputes around the regulator with Eskom and municipalities. So it will be interesting to hear discussion around that today in the context of just transition and how those amendments that are being proposed can assist the fast tracking of the just transition. The National Environmental Management Air Quality Act, it's one of the hooks that we are utilizing at the moment when it comes to reporting specifically around climate change issues. Having touched on that, I would like to give you insights also on the Eskom climate change strategy, and I will refer to it as a climate change strategy. We started having this strategy as early as 2007. We can basically undertake in terms of mitigating climate change, adapting to the changing climate, from a and what can we do to basically benchmark ourselves against other utilities. Since then, we've updated the strategy in 2010, 2012, 2015, and this year we find ourselves basically reviewing this strategy, and we've changed its name from a climate change strategy, and now it's calling it a climate resilient company, where we're looking at basically Eskom transition roadmap 2050. And we are trying to put pegs on the ground, of course, in line with the policy developments that are happening in the country. And I think Joni already touch on those policy enablers that the country is putting in place to ensure that a company like Eskom as a transition that can guide them from a policy perspective. And just to maybe give you a view on what has been the drivers around putting this strategy, of course, it's the transition itself that we find ourselves in, and the maintaining, Eskom maintaining competitiveness within South Africa in terms of allowing it to have access to finance, increase in the markets from a customer side of customers are demanding the change and saying we want to be able to choose what kind of energy that we consume. The legislation that I've already, carbon tax and carbon budget, those are some of the drivers. The integrated resources plan, I think everyone has seen the decommissioning plan that is already outlined in the integrated resources plan 2019, and that is one of the key drivers where Eskom is asking itself, as we change, as we become these three different businesses, what would it mean for our generation capacity? How do we still maintain a security of supply for the country? Another driver that I must also mention that we've also focused on is the vulnerability of the Eskom infrastructure and the adverse impacts which the just transition, or what you will refer to climate change, has. And another driver that a lot of people that have raised and from our different sectors is the risk of stranded assets. You know, those are some of the issues, some of the areas that, drivers that have basically driven our change in our new strategy. And with this strategy, one of the key, some of the key objectives that are driving strategy, we want to be able to define and advise on Eskom's participation in the new South African electricity supply market through an energy just transition mandate, which Johnny has started talking about, which I'm sure later on we will focus on, and what basically defining what is the energy just transition means for South Africa and for Eskom, and also start teasing out some of the initiatives that will contribute to an increase in Eskom's electricity supply and distribution base, ranging from new renewables to gas, embedded generation. And I think the RP basically outlines all the possible or potential technologies that we may look at. And of course, I must mention that to minimize the Eskom's financial penalties and liabilities and be able to basically chart a way to attracting green finance. Of course, we're still interested in implementing initiatives which will reduce Eskom's vulnerability to the adverse impacts of climate change, so that we basically ensure that Eskom's assets and operations, including its customers, are resilient to the changing climate. And this is one of the key things that we are focusing on at the moment, is to basically improve Eskom's social license to operate. And a lot of people, they usually get shocked when we say that actually it's at Eskom's interest to basically maintain its social license to operate. By that, we basically looking at how the it's about maintaining our socio-economic obligations, including with our stakeholders and the customers, and that we have at the moment. And some of you would know that we've started the decommissioning process of some of our power plants, and there's a work that has already started around basically developing these social plans, where we are using existing platforms to basically understand where we are shutting down these, or where we're going to shut down these power stations. What would that mean for the communities or the towns which have actually developed around those? So that work is continuing. And basically, and another objective for driving this strategy from an Eskom side has been, it's a way that Eskom is trying to collaborate with internal and external customers to be able to understand from a sustainability perspective. You've seen in media, there's a lot of issues that have been raised around our transparency, around our advocacy, and I think this strategy and the new office that has been created has been raised focus on those issues. Maybe I can also touch on the latest initiatives that we are busy with as a team. Transition project management offices. We're looking at the low carbon technology pathways that would fit Eskom's objectives. Basically, to support technology option assessment that we have with that are underway, emission reduction potentials, our renewable energy fleet, renewable energy space. This is what would work and what would not work. We're very much interested in the policy and position development around this, with a focus on how government basically articulates its position towards with a target of 2050, and we've seen that work continuing. And we look at investors, and I'm talking about our actual investors at the moment, and our future investors. See, we're already getting a lot of questions from our potential future investors, where they're asking us questions in terms of how we operate and where we see ourselves operate. And basically charting and explaining to South Africa what does Eskom's just transition mean as a whole. And I think I've touched on a whole range of things, which I think our presentation, follow-up presentations are also going to touch on the unbundling that's underway, the issues around the cost reflective tariff, the role of NERSA as we transition. Those are some of the areas that we are focusing on, looking at what would the amendments to the policies that we have, and the decarbonization itself, and looking at different ways and long-term thinking around that, and the initiatives that we can basically implement in the near future and in the long term. Thank you for the opportunity again.
Thank you so much, Luandle. That's a fascinating insight into how Eskom's preparing, and the work of Eskom in thinking about just transition, decarbonisation, and some of these other issues. I'd now like to turn to some of our presentations. So first of all, Chido Mazondo, a member of IISD's team based in Johannesburg. So perhaps you could give a summary of our research and IISD's work program at the moment, and introduce. Well, I'll let you have the floor, and you can explain how you see reform happening, and the context and some of the work that we've been doing.
Great, thank you, Richard. Just to check, is my screen sharing?
Yes.
Perfect. So good afternoon, everyone. My name is Chido Mzondo, and as my colleague Richard said, I'm an energy policy consultant for IISD based here in South Africa, in Johannesburg. It's a pleasure to be with you all, and thank you all for joining us. We're very excited to be having this webinar. So I'll be covering just an overview of who IISD is, our research areas in South Africa, and then our report, which is being launched in conjunction with this webinar, and it's called Rethinking Eskom: Lessons from Electricity Sector Reform in India and in Mexico. And then I'll briefly look at, because we're in a pandemic at the moment, what does the pandemic mean for Eskom reform? How might it influence the reform? Excuse me. So first of all, IISD works in nearly 100 countries in the 6 areas shown on the screen. The energy program works towards guiding the world's transition to sustainable energy systems. Much of the work is devoted to helping authorities choose the right system of electricity generation and reduce consumption of fossil-based transport fuels, while offering practical assistance in the implementation of the country's international climate change commitments. And in South Africa, IISD is currently focused on the energy program. So to look at the work that we've done to date, so if you look at for 1 to 3, this is the work that we've done. So the first piece of work was conducted and published in November last year, and was called Beyond Fossil Fuels: Fiscal Transition in BRICS. And this was a cross-country analysis for all BRICS countries to align BRICS fiscal policies with the clean energy transition. The report put forward that revenues from fossil fuels should be used strategically to help diversify economies away from fossil fuels and cover the social costs of the energy transition. And then secondly, the report Rethinking Eskom, this was published last month, and it explored 2 examples of electricity sector reform in India and in Mexico, who we'll hear from after myself. And the aim of this report was to go beyond the evaluation of the success or failure of reforms purely based on economic efficiency, but rather to look at also what lessons can we take from India and Mexico for South Africa regarding the impact of reform on electricity prices, jobs, decarbonization, and electricity sector ownership. Another piece of work that IISD has done in an essay is work around the just transition. And this was around an assessment of the needs and readiness. And so the research question which informed this was around what will happen as coal mining and power production ends in coal-dependent regions in the country. And my colleagues interviewed policymakers, experts, academics within the just transition space to explore the landscape in South Africa. Now, if we go to 4 to 6, these are projects that we are currently in the scoping phase or in the very early research phases. So the first is a policy brief on support measures and subsidies to liquid fuels in South Africa, so particularly coal to liquid, which Sasol is the biggest player in the country. The second being business models for community and publicly owned renewable energy deployment in South Africa. And then finally looking at identifying roadblocks to financing renewable energy in South Africa and potential solutions for removing them. So this is our report, and I encourage all of you, there is a link in the chat to the report on our website. And again, just to reiterate, we want to look at a broader range of factors for how the reform could impact electricity prices, jobs and employment, decarbonization, and electricity sector ownership. So this is a table that we've extracted from the report. And again, I encourage you to go to the report because it has further detail. But I just want to draw your attention. So this is the standard model, a brief overview, and then this is what occurred in India and Mexico. This is South Africa at the moment, and this is what South Africa, the electricity sector will look like according to Eskom's roadmap. So just to give an understanding of what the standard model of reform is. So the standard model of electricity sector reform was first developed and deployed in OECD countries in the context of overcapacity, well-functioning markets, and established institutions. Since the 1990s, this model has been recommended by international organizations such as the World Bank, with the main goal of reform to optimize economic efficiency in the electricity sector. To achieve this, the main these categories are proposed: so regulation, unbundling, ownership, and competition. So briefly to go over them. So regulation, this is about creating a system of independent regulation to remove conflicts of interest and to help improve transparency. Secondly, around unbundling, which Luandle made mention of. So this is restructuring with the goal of fully vertically and horizontally unbundling the sector. Often unreformed electricity sectors consist of a vertically or horizontally integrated or state-owned utility, as is the case in South Africa, meaning that the utility is responsible for all or most of the functions of the sector, so generation, transmission, distribution, and retail of electricity. So in practice, unbundling means separating the sector into generation, transmission, and retail functions, and then creating several independent corporatized entities to operate each of these functions. And then thirdly, if we look at ownership, so this is around promoting private sector participation by encouraging private sector investment in new assets and privatizing existing assets. And then finally, competition. So ensuring competition takes place throughout the sector by creating markets, especially in the retail and wholesale generation parts of the system. Competition is encouraged throughout the sector, but in practice, transmission is a national monopoly, and it is less likely that several transmission entities are created to compete. And this could also be the case for parts of the distribution sector. So that's a brief overview of what the standard model of reform looks like. So despite this being the default economic prescription for several decades, the standard model requires rethinking in order to adapt it to place social and environmental impacts alongside economic considerations. For example, in South Africa, we face high levels of poverty and inequality, alongside high greenhouse gas emissions due to our coal dependence. And these are factors which need to be accounted for in the reform. So now to give a very brief overview of our report, and I promise this is my final, I encourage you to go to our website. The link is in the chat. And these are just a few key findings and recommendations. So firstly, many countries have taken a pragmatic approach, implementing reforms where they are expected to be effective and politically feasible, and accepting the status quo in some areas. So from this work that we've done, we really believe that South Africa should be pragmatic about electricity sector reform. Reform in this country should go beyond economic efficiency, but also consider the needs to keep prices of electricity affordable for the poor and for the vulnerable, provide decent jobs, reduce our coal dependence, and also acknowledging calls to retain forms of public and community ownership. The second point that we found in our report was that neither India nor Mexico instituted market-based electricity tariffs for all end consumers, and they instead chose to maintain prices at prices at a below cost level. And as a result, most electricity prices were not at a cost recovery level. And this is one of the main drivers for the continued financial problems in what we saw in India and in Mexico. And this also showed that there was a need for ongoing financial assistance for the sector. And so if we're looking at South Africa, we can see that without pricing reform, unbundling alone is unlikely to have much of an impact on South Africa's electricity prices or Eskom's financial problems. And ongoing financial assistance from the government is highly likely or necessary. And then thirdly, around consumer subsidies, another result of maintaining below cost electricity tariffs in both India and in Mexico is that electricity consumer subsidies continued to feature in the system. We understand that untargeted subsidies can encourage wasteful consumption, and they often disproportionately benefit the rich, who tend to consume more energy. And this leads to unsustainable costs to the public budget. So we strongly believe that inefficient electricity subsidies should be removed. And in the case of South Africa, learning from India and Mexico, there's a need for well-designed, targeted support that's provided to the poor and vulnerable consumers to ensure access to reliable, affordable, safe, and modern forms of electricity. Sort of a last overview on the report. So understanding the impact of electricity sector reform on jobs is a key issue for ensuring a just transition occurs in South Africa. And it was quite nice to hear both from Jonkaya and Lwandle that there is work around jobs and a just transition. Data from our work, data remains limited regarding impacts on employment both in India and in Mexico. There has been some work to date conducted in South Africa on this by various organizations, some of which might be participating. However, it requires further investigation going forward. Secondly, in terms of unbundling, reforms that combine unbundling with the introduction of competition and private sector participation in generation allowed an acceleration of renewable energy deployment due to the high competitiveness of renewable energy technologies in India and in Mexico. And as a result, these renewable energy projects have been mostly privately developed and owned. Many stakeholders, as we know in South Africa, are concerned about the privatization of electricity sector assets, and both case studies have sought to implement only partial privatization as part of their reforms, which is a distancing from the standard model of reform. And here's an example of how they adapted the reform to their context. However, in South Africa, because most renewable energy projects are privately developed and owned, reform could arise in further opposition to private ownership, which may create a barrier to decarbonization in South Africa. So if public ownership and state-owned enterprises are to continue to play a strong role in the sector, there remain questions around how they can also support decarbonization and a just transition. Given the dual need to decarbonize and to retain a form of public ownership in South Africa, future research is needed to evaluate how municipal, public, community ownership could integrate renewables into South Africa, And then now looking very briefly at, my colleague Richard touched on it, but obviously we all know we're living in, a new normal because of COVID-19, and we had a question around, what will the reform look like post-COVID? And we know that reform of the electricity sector has been a key priority for the Ramaphosa administration, but it's around how will COVID change this? So there are 4 new forces that we believe are acting on the sector at the moment. Falling demand, which has increased somewhat since we've gone down from Schedule 5 to Schedule 3 of lockdown. Broad economic shock, the increasingly precarious position of workers, and then also the demands for stimulus across the economy, including in the electricity sector. So although there may be uncertainty regarding what a post-COVID South Africa will look like, these forces create the need for a fundamental rethink of the short and medium-term electricity sector reform plans. As policymakers contemplate how to kickstart the economy, electricity sector stimulus should be on the table. However, the design of the stimulus should be driven by the same principles that should guide the reform of the sector more generally, so which contribute to equity, poverty reduction, and reduction of environmental pollution. And then finally, stimulus should avoid locking in polluting energy at public expense and should instead lay the groundwork for transition away from coal. Similarly, support for renewable energy should be designed to maximize community and public benefits and prioritize job security in areas with high levels of unemployment. And in terms of unemployment, this graph that I have up is from work done by Statistics South Africa. And they surveyed respondents and looking at how COVID and how lockdown in South Africa impacted their sources of income. So if you look at the gray is their source of income prior to lockdown, and then the blue is during lockdown. And you can see in every category except UIF, the Unemployment Insurance Fund, most respondents reported a decrease in their income or no income at all. And of course, we would expect UIF to increase because people are making more claims to the fund. So as is evident from this, and also just from what's been discussed before, a revised reform agenda should take the effective jobs into account, safeguarding jobs and job security. Similarly, the aftermath of COVID-19 on the country as a whole will require Eskom to adapt its reform agenda to the post-pandemic reality. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Chido. That's a whistle-stop tour through our work there. Fascinating. I'd like to move with no further ado to Shruti Sharma to talk about the reform experience from India. So Shruti, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Richard. I'm just going to quickly share my screen here. There we go. I'm just confirming you can see that.
Yep, that's coming through well. Thank you.
All right, then. Thank you so much for inviting me to speak. Hello, everyone. I'm an associate and energy specialist with IISD for the last 7 years. My work mostly focuses on energy subsidies and how they can be targeted better. I'm based in Bangalore in India, and I'm here to share some examples from India's electricity sector, more specifically the reforms undertaken by the sector and what impact they had on electricity prices. So let's begin with a quick snapshot of the electricity sector in India. The private sector accounts for 46%, while the state and the central government own 54% of the total installed capacity of 360 gigawatt as of August 2019. Most of the grid electricity generated in India is fueled by coal, and this share is decreasing slowly as the percentage of grid-scale renewable increases. So in 2019-20, 72% of the electricity generated was from coal compared to 74% in 3 years ago. And the share of renewables in electricity generation is increasing and is currently at 7% from solar and wind. Now, because of coal's dominance, most subsidies to the electricity sector therefore support fossil fuels. And electricity subsidies are significant, especially to the transmission and distribution sector. They are the largest fossil fuel subsidies, and they doubled from about $6 to about $12 billion between 2014 to 2019. And most of these subsidies have been for financial bailout packages for distribution companies, providing very poorly targeted subsidies to households and farmers, increasing access to grid access to rural households, and also improving the grid infrastructure. So let's look at the most significant reform that took place driven by the Electricity Act in 2003. Now, electricity is a subnational subject in India, which means that the national government can provide broad regulatory frameworks, but implementation of those policies is a decision that belongs to the subnational or the state governments. And that is why it's very difficult to form a uniform review of the sector in India, as some state governments do a better job of implementing than others. Some quick storytelling here. So once upon a time in the early 1990s, each Indian state had its own state electricity board, which was vertically integrated state-owned monopoly. And but the sector faced many challenges like low quality power supply, lack of sufficient investment in infrastructure, low energy access, rising debt. And this decade saw some private sector participation in generation, but that didn't really solve any of the challenges listed here. We fast forward to 2003 when the Electricity Act is introduced, and that sort of set the framework for reform, and the large vertically integrated utilities were unbundled into generation, transmission, and distribution functions. And each state created several distribution companies for these functions. And we saw a long list of impacts from this unbundling, like improvements in technical performance, increase in electricity access, improved transparency, improved governance of the utilities, increased competition, private sector participation, so on. But there was still rising debt. And here's the catch for it, unbundling. The way different states experimented with unbundling created differences between them. So not every state implemented reforms in the same way or to the same extent, especially in terms of creating those distribution utilities. So the number of distribution utilities established in each state varied, and different states adopted different business models depending on the extent of private sector participation and ownership that they desired. So for example, some states fully privatized their distribution sector, but other states employed a more franchisee model where different functions were contracted to private franchisees. And the this franchisee model was very successful in some states, like in Maharashtra, where the aggregate technical and commercial losses came down, but it saw really mixed results in other places. And so just to say that even after unbundling, several states still follow practices that limit the separation of these different functions, and they possibly inhibit independent functioning, suggesting that distribution utilities in unbundled states do not always function independently. And I'll give an example of this in my next slide. So what was the impact of this very significant reform on electricity prices? Actually, not much. Electricity prices, like Chido also explained, continue to be regulated for end consumers in all Indian states. Subsidies are very prominent. A key driver of the financial stress that remains is underpriced electricity for agricultural and residential consumers. These subsidies were 49% of all quantified energy subsidies in India, nearly $12 billion in 2017. Subsidies remain untargeted, again, something that Chido touched upon here, but something to emphasize again is that over 50% of all the benefits from electricity subsidies were captured by 40% of the most affluent households. Of course, this analysis is based on a very dated data set, and IISD is trying to assess and reproduce these figures based on a new data set in India. We'll soon share this analysis. A key point to emphasize is that electricity tariff setting mechanism is routinely influenced by state governments and state departments and political parties. So perhaps what we'll do is we'll quickly touch upon how electricity tariffs are set, just to understand how influencing continues to take place in spite of unbundling. So we undertook a study in one of the most populous states in India, Uttar Pradesh, which has very high poverty rates, and at that time had low energy access rates, to understand how different stakeholders influence the tariff setting process. Theoretically, tariff reform should happen annually. And how it starts is the distribution utilities submit a document called the Annual Revenue Requirement to the state's independent electricity regulator. Each state has its own independent electricity regulator. The regulator analyzes this request, it clarifies any information gaps in the document, reviews the methodology, what the utilities used for asking for a tariff revision. And finally, the regulator, after reviewing public views, reviewing all the documents, reviewing the utilities' financials, and also, of course, following the rules of the Electricity Act, it finally revises the tariffs and issues them in a document called the Tariff Order. So when we start understanding the role of different stakeholders, their motivations, and understand power structures between them, we identify what are the likely blockers or proponents of tariff reform. And we find that both political parties and government agencies are trying to influence the independent electricity regulator and the utilities, depending on the extent of influence they can exert on either of those agencies. So the government agency is interested in determining an appropriate tariff for the consumers. So public perception about the ruling government is maintained. Political parties are also interested in the same thing. And the utility in all of this just wants to manage its operations and finances really well. And the regulator in all of this just wants to operate independently. But that really doesn't happen. So I've got some examples here on what really happened and how the whole tariff setting mechanism is compromised. So every time there's a state election, and we saw this in the state in 2002, 2012, 2016, every time there's a state election, the tariff setting mechanism is routinely halted. And how that typically happens is that the ruling party, political party, influences either the utility or the regulator to delay the whole tariff setting mechanism. So typically it'll influence the utility to delay submitting the ARR, which is the first step in the tariff revision, or utilities will delay submitting any of the financial accounts or the documents that the regulator will ask for. So basically halt any step that would delay the introduction of a revised tariff. And something that we see very commonly with price subsidies is being used as political sops. So the ruling parties will adopt populist measures, leaving the implementation of reform as a problem for succeeding governments. And typically before elections, political parties announce reduced residential tariffs, free electricity to select voter groups like power loom weavers that are an important voter base in the state. Now, just a final slide on COVID-19 and India's electricity sector. I think just in the interest of time, I'll leave this slide with some key messages here, but I really want to say that, that under COVID-19, the utilities finances continue to be strained. And in response, the government has announced some financial relief measures, and the biggest one being a bailout package. We are monitoring the situation continuously, but our stand on this is that unless the distribution utilities finances are not sustainable, it will not be a situation to in a situation to handle any kind of shocks, and will require frequent government bailouts, as we have seen repeatedly in India. So with that, I think I'm going to stop here and maybe hand over back to Rich.
Thank you very much, Shruti. Fascinating stuff. And now we're going to move straight on to Alejandro. So we're very pleased to have him with us from the Mexico Autonomous Institute of Technology. And we're looking forward to hearing about the reforms and the electricity sector of Mexico. So Alejandro, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you very much, Richard. Let me see if I can share the screen. Can you all see it now?
It's just coming up now. Yep, it's yeah. You might need to start as a presentation, I think. So we can see that slide, but we can also. Yeah.
Great.
Perfect.
Well, first of all, thank you for the invitation and good morning from Mexico City. And just to keep it moving along, I would like to first give you a very brief story of where Mexico's electricity sector comes from and where we are right now, because it's an interesting point in time. So just very briefly, Mexico's power sector was nationalized in 1960 in the wake of other European economies which had done so in the previous decades. And from then onwards, it was South Africa and India vertically integrated state monopoly. You know, the whole industry operated in that way. And what happened is that that model worked for a certain time, but eventually there began to some laggings or shortcomings were quite noticeable, prominently starting in the 90s, in terms of underinvestment, aging infrastructure, inefficient generation base, and inefficient tariff setting mechanisms. And eventually, the times went along, but the but the model did not evolve accordingly. So some liberalization and reform efforts started in the 90s. However, it wasn't until 2013 and 2014 that a huge, I would say, an opening was created and found politically and socially to push forward a huge overhaul of not only the power industry, but the whole energy landscape. And what happened essentially was many of the elements and components that have been mentioned by this point. The industry was unbundled. There was a vertical and horizontal separation of the incumbent utility, which is CFE. And we have a new horizon in the Mexican power sector, in which generation is a completely competitive activity. Transmission and distributions remained as state-exclusive activities, and we have a new procurement mechanisms in the form of auctions, which is something that I understand is well, nowadays it's very common. And excuse me, and we have it's a whole new dynamic. And what has happened more recently is that in 2018 we had a general election. We had a general election, and what we've seen from then onwards for the past 2 years is a sea change and the change of heart of the new administration with regard to the reform. And what they have consistently put forward is a reversal or a rollback to the model that was implemented since 2013 and 2014. So knowing that, I will give you four basic lessons that we have concluded here in Mexico, and that hopefully it will be of some help when the time comes to designing and actually implementing a new reform model in South Africa. So the first lesson, the first recommendation I would highlight is that you need to be bold, and you need to be bold because the opportunity to change the rules, the mechanisms, the process that govern the power sector in your country is going to be, it's time limited. And for when this window opens, you need to take advantage of it, and you need to push forward and make the most changes that you want and that you desire. And for that, you need to set clear and ambitious goals. It's not really going to be useful if you take an incremental approach, and for that you need hard targets. You need to align your whole vision with decarbonization targets, with the whole country's climate policy. You really need to think even beyond the power sector and the energy landscape. Second, you need a strong leadership and competent managers, and you need this because it will be very difficult to have an effective reform if you don't have political will behind the initiative. And also, you will need at the senior management level, you need specialists, and you need technical knowledge of how to implement these sort of reforms, because it's a highly specialized field to implement. This was particularly important here in Mexico because what we see nowadays is that the reform was so comprehensive and wide-ranging that it has sustained so far, I would say, fairly well, despite the changing heart of the incoming administration. Also, you need to have a campaign strategy and organization like a mindset, because it's as you already know, and as you have seen in all countries that have implemented an overhaul of these characteristics, there will be resistance and there will be opposition moving in another direction and breaking with the inertia of the past. And that's it's pretty significant because it's not something that we who usually work in the energy space would have as an initial thought, but in our experience here in Mexico, it was most definitely a success factor to build the broadest coalition possible to enact the reform. When we enacted the reform 7-8 years ago, it was crucial to, as I said, to make it as comprehensive as possible. And to that end, it was a huge package that included a constitutional amendment, which is more permanent and more difficult to question and modify down the line, as well with a legal a set of laws, over 20, that were also affected by the new model. And what this provides for is a very robust platform and an integral view of the whole power sector. And this leads to the next point, which is power sector reform is different than CFE and ESCOM reform. Usually, and this is something that also happened in Mexico, we used to talk indistinctly of power sector reform and CFE reform. When we talk about the utility, it's a huge, if not the most important component of the reform package. However, what we need to see at this point in time is that it's only a piece of the whole puzzle. And when we talk about power sector reform, we not only talk about unbundling and company restructuring, but also we have to talk about a new institutional framework, a new tariff setting mechanisms, and different roles that have to be distributed among several players to ensure that the whole system is working appropriately. And that's why you have to clearly separate what's competence of the utility and how you want to change it. And second of all, how you want authorities and how you want the regulator and the policymakers to perform within this ecosystem. And this is obviously, even though utility reform or ESCOM reform is one huge chunk of the whole reform, it is probably the most important. And I say it's the greatest challenge because here in Mexico, what we found out is that company transformation, and especially for companies that are this big and are so integrated and have such a long history and culture, change is difficult. And probably, to be honest, effective change will take even a generation to completely transform. And I highlight this because it's probably from within the company where the most of the resistance or the business as usual mindset will come from, and those are those are ways of thinking and ways of doing things that are deeply ingrained in the incumbent utility, and they are not, and I wouldn't like to say right or wrong, but they might eventually differ from the reform agenda. So that's something that needs to have in mind. So first of all, it's be bold, and you need to think of the whole model and not only of the different pieces separately. Second, you need to be conscious. You need to be conscious, and you need to understand the domestic and the international context in which the reform is happening. And this is a point to what Chiro was saying at the beginning. You need to understand what are the sensitivities within a country. For example, from what I've learned recently through the paper and from our conversation, the just transition and the labor issue is something very particular, sensitive, and that needs to be addressed in the South African context. In Mexico, we can talk about a sort of nationalism, which is something that needs to be addressed, and which is the current agenda of the government. So when you start to design and above all to implement the reform, you need to be conscious that there are stakeholders involved, that there are vested interests, and that there are different power plays that will enable or obstruct the implementation of the reform. Also, you need to think beyond economics and efficiency. That's probably a mistake that was committed in Mexico. The main focus of the reform was to set forward a more efficient and power sector, which in itself is perfectly okay, but it might lose sight of the other components of the reform that come at play, and that are certainly crucial. What am I talking about? First of all, environmental considerations. We see it nowadays to the extent that the current administration has a very heavy pro-fossil fuel agenda. You can argue that that's because the environmental focus and edge of the reform was very weak and was lacking in the past couple of years. Also, I would also put a lot of emphasis on the social considerations of the reform agenda. That's also something that was not a priority, I would say, in Mexico's reform. I'm talking about specifically social impact assessments and all the social permitting and doing all the, especially indigenous consultations, and all that stakeholder engagement mechanisms were something that were nominally included in the reform, but in reality it was something that we're gonna deal with it later as we implement it. And it has had an impact so far, not only in terms of representing a bottleneck for certain projects, both generation and transmission, but also because having a strong social component is a source of legitimacy and can be a source of broadening the coalition that I was mentioning before. And finally, in this section, do not oversell the reform. That's also a mistake that was committed here in Mexico. There are a broad set of I would say that of advantages and benefits from the reform. And at the time, you have to be very cautious and you have to select which ones you're going to promote and push forward as the main benefits of the reform publicly. I say this because at the end, you don't want there to be a backlash as it happened here in Mexico, in which promises that were made were not ostensibly, they were not fulfilled, and that fueled the backlash inertia here in the country. Specifically talking about lowering end-use prices. No, as it has been mentioned so far, end-use prices are still heavily subsidized here in Mexico. Next, you have to be smart, and here you have to have a well-defined institutional framework, with a clear separation of power and authorities. You need a fiscal regime that is clear and competitive. You need a rate-setting mechanism that is transparent. All subsidies, because there are going to be subsidies, they have to be included at the fiscal level, and it's much more cleaner if it's something that is internalized ex post the rate setting mechanism and methodology itself, because that you can clearly see what each component represents in the end tariff or the end rate, and afterwards you include the end use subsidy. Also, you need a clear procurement mechanisms, which were the auctions here in Mexico, which were a big success, a huge success, I would say. Have currently over 80 projects that started construction. Mostly of them are operated, and we reached prices from solar and wind under the $20 per megawatt hour space. So that's something that's been quite good, no? So you don't have to please do not ignore grid maintenance and expansion. That's something that we left for here in Mexico for a second moment, or for something that we would do down the line. The main focus and the most contentious issue is usually generation. That was the case in Mexico, but if you, to the extent that you can get the utility to commit to the grid maintenance and expansion agenda, and make them see that that is or should be the backbone of the whole system. It will alleviate and depressurize other agendas. Why do I say that? Because nowadays we see that the government, which is very fossil fuel reliant, they want to curtail, contrary to what's happening in all the world, they want to curtail renewable generation, which is mostly privately owned, to dispatch, to change the dispatch order and give a priority to the fossil fuel generation of the incumbent utility. You know, so you need to create a margin, and you have to have a healthy and redundant transmission and distribution network. Also, if I may make a critique to the paper, which I think is pretty useful, and I recommend everyone gives it a read. It does not mention the establishment of an independent system operator, which I think is paramount when we talk about electricity sector reform. To the extent that you can separate economic dispatch at the management of an electricity wholesale market, and take that away from the scope of the incumbent company and transfer that to the state as an independent authority, that is a huge step, and that will make the whole difference. First of all, to have a reliable dispatch of energy, to give security to the whole investment community, and it will make things much more easier if you eliminate that conflict of interest of the system operator being embedded within the incumbent utility. So that is a big component. All in the same line, strengthen regulatory agencies. I mean, I used to work in Mexico's energy regulatory agency, and I believe that independence needs to be earned rather than granted by some statute or reform. But to get to that point, you need to have the resources and capacities, and I'm talking the human, the technological, the technical, the material capacities to actually perform. And so that is important, that you can provide all these resources to the regulatory agency. Also, you need dispute resolution mechanisms in place. And that is something we've learned recently here in Mexico. The fact that we had a clear pathway for injunctions and the judicialization of different cases was clearly beneficial for the whole industry. And if all these rules are clear and transparent in the reform, it will have a lasting power. And also you need to have diversification as a guiding principle of the reform, always talking about technological sources, a diversity of suppliers, and also a healthy number of supply chains to be able to provide the electricity throughout the country. And finally, I would say, in order to implement the reform, you need to be pragmatic. First of all, you need to identify which are the deal breakers in the reform agenda, and the elements, the components that cannot be sacrificed. From what I've heard, I don't know, hypothetically, maybe in the reform agenda, you don't want unbundling to be compromised or threatened at some point. So that's in your deal breaker list. But perhaps if this needs to be negotiated with a counterpart, you need to know how and when to concede, probably for the more peripheral or the less important components of the reform. I don't know, maybe the appointment mechanism for the regulatory commissioners, or you know, there's a myriad of things that can be discussed in this in this point. Also, you should not be afraid at some point of grandfathering in some components of the old regime into the new model. For example, some generation plants, and having legacy contracts that are still governed by the old rules in the new landscape. Especially because that's probably one bargain chip that's at the disposal of the reform agenda, and in the end it can be an incentive to pass a more comprehensive and wide-ranging reform. Also, there is an important balancing act that has to happen between competitive or cost-reflective rate setting and the subsidy policy. Here, to the extent that you include a competitive generation, you will have a greater margin, efficiency margin. And so what do you do with that efficiency margin or efficiency gain? Well, you either lower the cost of the electricity at the wholesale and you have a more competitive rate base, or you reduce the amount of inefficient subsidy that's being applied in the country. It really doesn't matter what you do. What you have to have in mind is that you need a pathway, you need a path forward and an end game of how you are going to reduce the inefficient subsidies. That's something that wasn't sufficiently discussed here in Mexico. And what we have is that we inherited the subsidy regime, but we don't have in the medium to long term a way to get rid of it. No, we didn't set a hard target of how we were going to focus the subsidy for who really needs it. So we have a generalized subsidy. We didn't say, and we didn't establish in law that we would substitute the generalized subsidy policy with a distributed generation program for certain sectors of the population. So we got kind of modeled and stuck in that respect. So it's important to have always an idea of when and how you're going to get off the subsidies. Also, the renewal, you need it's something that is brought on, and it's a very important point of the paper. You cannot permit, or you cannot let that renewable energy become synonym with private energy. It's something that happened in Mexico. And that is why there's so much conflict right now in Mexico's power sector. Because the government, fossil fueled agenda, they are setting these policies and cracking down on renewable energy, but they're really not, they don't have something particular or personal against renewable energy. They don't like private energy. So what's happened there is that the benefits of cost reductions and environmental benefits of renewable energy were not made available for the incumbent company. And that's why you have to prepare the company for reform, and you need to give it some financial and operational help for it to compete and for it to feel that it can, that there is a level playing field and that they can participate in the new model and under the new rules. And so that's crucial. Also, the COVID-19 crisis presents it's a two-edged knife or two-edged sword here, because you can either put forward a recovery package that is pro-cyclical and anti-cyclical, and that includes some spending and investment on the renewable side of the asset base, or as we can see in Mexico, and to some extent also I think in the US, you can see the government taking the opportunity to further crack down on renewables and in the name of reliability, which everyone who participates and works in our industry knows that it's mostly a false debate. And finally, this is a long road, and you have to prepare for stranded assets, and it's going to be a bumpy transition ahead.
Thank you very much, Alejandro. I think that's a good point to end on. So thank you very much to all our panelists. If we were in a physical space, I'm sure we'd have a round of applause, but it doesn't work quite so well on the webinar. But thank you very much. I think that's fascinating, and it's really interesting to see the different contexts, but also the similarities that I'm sure many of us will be reflecting on while you're talking there about some areas that sound very eerily familiar. So now for the final part of the webinar, we've got a panel discussion. So how this is going to work is I'm going to pose 3 panel questions, and then we're going to ask our panel, which is Salim Fakir from the Africa Climate Foundation, Professor Anton Eberhard of the University of Cape Town, Lauren Hermanis from ADAPT, Matthew Parks from COSATU. We're going to come to the panelists in that order, and what I would ask you to do is you can respond to any or all of the questions that I'm going to kind of ask as the starting questions. You can also respond to anything you've heard the panelists say as well. So I'm going to give you 5 minutes each, and I realize that we're very pressed for time, so please don't abuse that kind of the freedom I'm going to give you, and try and stick close. And I've been very lenient on the speakers, but I will be come down very hard on the panelists if they overspeak or speak for too long. So the questions that I think I'd really like to hear about are, the first one is, to what extent can unbundling contribute to helping to resolve the current crisis in the electricity sector? Is the focus on unbundling essential, or is it crowding out other reform priorities? The second point is, how has coronavirus changed the context here? And the third point is, how can we balance the need for job creation, particularly in areas that are facing job losses, with the need to minimize operating costs and increase economic efficiency in the energy sector? So first, I'm going to come to Salim. So please go ahead. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Richard. And this was a really important piece of work, and I think the various case studies were very useful. And I think most people who live in South Africa would say the Mexican case study is very germane, and resonates with some of the politics that's going on around reform issues here in South Africa. I think I will make 2 or 3 salient points. I'm not going to go into too much detail on other things. But I want to also, because I was involved in the early part of this research, and I think, Richard, it's important to give it a sense of why this research was undertaken. And I think, if I may take a fig leaf from 2 books, one by Edward Said and the other one is Noam Chomsky, and this was really, the titles is around the responsibility of intellectuals. This was really about the responsibility of researchers and what they furnish as evidence. Because I think that a lot of work on reform and unbundling it's fair to say that there's been a lot of research that has been done that has tended to politicize issues more than actually help to bridge the divide. And partly that much of the research, I would argue, has been sort of banal abstraction without a reflection on the nitty-gritty of how these countries have actually tried to evolve reform and try to marry these 4 areas of indices that you guys have used in your research. So I think that researchers have an enormous responsibility to provide evidence that is not what I would call describes a confirmation bias, but really to help politicians along the journey and not become wary, sort of lobbyists, because politicians are very, very wary of lobbyists and single-minded pursuit of ideas such as privatization and unbundling. And as Alexandro has pointed out, that if it smacks of privatization and IPPs as being a platform for privatization, there will be a lot of resistance. And I think what both the studies really illustrate that reforms are not simple things that can happen very fast, but there's a lot of politics to navigate. And how, I think that the studies didn't really capture the nature of the political coalitions that that you need to actually gather around a certain consensus that these reforms need to be done, and they need to be done in a particular way that meets the different interests of different constituencies. Unbundling Eskom has major implications for not only South Africa, but for the entire electricity sector, as has been pointed out. And it's very insightful that many of these countries have actually moved away from the standard model, which I think is another word, is sort of the Washington consensus. I think it's been alluded to that earlier. So I want to stress that the kind of responsibility researchers have is really to figure out how to navigate a pathway that sets certain pillars in place that allow reform to be scaled with time, and that in fact has the support of a broad coalition, not only of key constituencies, but also leadership. Finally, because I know we're running out of time and we want to not only listen to me, but also other panelists, I would say that the current approach of the CEO of Eskom, despite people's chagrin that he's moving too slow and that unbundling is not really taking place in a kind of imagined way that it should happen, I think the CEO is quite aware of Eskom, is quite aware of the frictions and the politics that he has to engage. And therefore, he's being quite, I think, astute in thinking about unbundling in a way that makes sense, that is palatable, that can be easily socialized, and is not in the end going to be threatened to a reversal. And we're seeing that happening in Mexico at the present moment. So he has to bring on board a wide group of people. I would say that broad coalition doesn't exist around Eskom's reform in the way it should, and it has to be worked on. And I think that the context in which the CEO of Eskom is operating in describes actually the fact that the playing field is quite divided about how reforms should take place. He probably doesn't have the kind of political backing he needs to move this in a manner that he wants. And finally, I would say that there's such an obsession with Eskom and what Eskom needs to look like in the future. We are missing a very big component of other reforms, and this is the wider power sector reform that has been alluded to earlier, in which we can shift ownership models to a more diverse set of models. We've talked about IPP rollout. That REIPP has to be reinvigorated and has to get off the road again. But there's also soon municipalities may be able to participate. It's still a long journey, I believe. Larger firms and well-to-do houses and even communities must be able to engage in self-generation. That part of the reform is not being tackled in a structured and managed way currently, because everybody is focusing on Eskom, and rightfully so. But I think we all agree that we cannot put all our eggs in one basket, that we have to actually diversify the supply of electricity in South Africa, and we have to work on a vision that is broader than Eskom to be able to achieve that. So let me leave it at that, because I think I've said enough for now. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you very much. Can we go straight to Anton, please? You're still on mute there.
Sorry.
Perfect, thank you.
Thanks, Richard. Thanks to the presenters. Let me address your first question around why unbundling is so critical, and also argue that it doesn't actually rule out other necessary reforms, some of them just mentioned by Salim. So the first conclusion and the first recommendation of the study, that we should not just blindly apply and adopt the standard model of power sector reform, is one that I agree with. So standard power sector reform is generally includes unbundling, but then also wholesale and retail competition and privatization. And what we're discussing in South Africa is not full privatization. It's not been part of any of the policy pronouncements by the president or the ministers or in the Eskom roadmap. Neither are we talking about full retail competition, but we are talking about unbundling, so the separation of generation, transmission and distribution. And I think in a very pragmatic way, and in the least disruptive way. So we've said that we would start with taking out transmission and the system operator. So an ITSMO, an independent transmission and system market operator, combined with the planning, the procurement, and the contracting functions. And I think there are two broad reasons why we are going on this path. The one is around operational improvements within Eskom. And these are largely being achieved through the current divisionalization initiative within Eskom. So it's recognizing that these are very different businesses. Distribution is customer focused, customer facing. Generation in Eskom is essentially around fixing old kit. So one will get more management focus, one will get more cost transparency, and I think all of these things are good. But we recognize that divisionalization is just a step, it's not sufficient to the fundamental transformation of the sector. And that occurs when transmission in particular with the system operator comes out as a separate legal entity, state-owned still. And it's fundamental and transformational in the sense that it allows a fair and transparent platform for then contracting least cost power, which will then be mostly renewables and will set the entity on a new path. So I agree with Salim, we need to get a broader coalition of support amongst all the stakeholders around these steps and to make the arguments better around the advantages that will accrue when we do have an independent transmission and system operator. So the investment that will come in, the security of supply through getting additional resources, remembering that the IRP envisages decommissioning of some 11,000 megawatts of coal, that we will replace it with 6,000 megawatts of solar and 14,000 megawatts of wind by 2030. So there's a huge, a lot of work that has to be done around bringing in this new investment and getting security of supply. And I think IISMO creates the platform for this. Because it's least cost as well, we would see some lower prices for generation coming in, given the kind of huge cost reductions we've seen with solar and wind. It sets us obviously on a sustainable path. And then finally, it's good for jobs as well. And I think this issue hasn't been mapped out enough, is that there's a real potential for serious jobs growth in the renewables sector, both at utility scale, but also at the distributed energy generation level. And in that respect, I think there's a good story that can be told in terms of post-COVID economic stimulation, investment brought in through the private sector, which is job-intensive, job generating through this, through the kind of procurements that will happen to fulfill the IRP plan could be very significant going forward.
Thank you very much. Next, can I move to Lauren Hermanis, please?
Thanks. Can you hear me? This is
yes, we can hear you very well. Thank you.
Okay, great, fantastic. So I just want to start by saying thank you very much to Shruti and Alejandro for those presentations. And you definitely sparked some thoughts as for me as you were speaking. Lots to resonate with the South African context. So I also want to respond to some of the issues that Salim and Anton have responded to, particularly around your first question, Richard. And I think, you know, part of the issue in South Africa is that there are just so many stakeholders who don't fully understand what is implied under unbundling, exactly what it entails. And so there's a lot of misunderstanding and obviously misapprehension around that. And I think that, you know, to the point of kind of coalition building, it's hard to build coalitions when there is so much uncertainty and then quite a lot of mischief making within that uncertain landscape. And so, you know, to this point of sort of not overselling what the unbundling will do, I think one thing that sort of occurred, that's pops up in my mind, is that, you know, very recently we've had another revelation of Eskom was called before the Portfolio Committee of Public Enterprises for an irregular expenditure of 4 billion rand to an unknown supplier. You know, I think this is not to undermine the unbundling agenda at all. It's sort of a parallel point to say, I think that there are issues around communication and transparency within the utility and around the utility that are not going to be cleared up by these. In fact, the kind of lack of transparency and good communication that characterizes Eskom's operations also applies to, I think, some of the unbundling story, that we really need to improve communications if we are to build broad support for this agenda. And I don't think that enough is being done to make sure that a whole range of stakeholders are really brought along with that. So the other point that I wanted to raise was, I thought, so again, not arguing that unbundling at all means that we can't focus on other areas of reform, but certainly I think, you know, thinking about this current COVID context, we have in South Africa a situation where our city governments and some of the other municipal governments are responsible for electricity distribution, and those municipalities, which were already struggling to finance their distribution grids and to fulfill a whole other range of mandates that they have as municipal governments in South Africa, are now under increased pressure. And so absolutely, it is really imperative, and I'm glad that this also resonates with the Indian case as well. It's really imperative that we understand what is going to happen with distribution going forward, and particularly with distribution as managed by our municipal governments. And I don't think that there's been nearly enough attention on that part of the story. Again, this is not an I'm not arguing that unbundling has sort of crowded out those discussions. I just think those discussions need to happen in parallel, and I think it's great that we have a sort of an indication of the importance of the discussions in other countries, as well. And then, you know, to the point of you know, tying the sort of the discussion on South Africa's energy transition to a discussion about COVID, post-COVID economic recovery, I think that's absolutely imperative. The issue, again, in South Africa is that there is a lack of consensus when we talk about jobs, what we even mean. So it's hard to have some of those conversations and build the necessary consensus to move forward in a coherent way, because of this lack of clarity. And so there are a number of initiatives, I think, to start to create that clarity. But again, we're not there. You know, this is when people speak about the number of jobs, and Chido, you mentioned it in your presentation as well, that could possibly come from moving forward with increased investment in renewable energy in South Africa. You know, all relevant stakeholders do not understand, do not trust in the metrics used and put forward by different researchers in that space, and they don't mean the same thing when they talk about jobs and and they don't share this same expectation around what a good quality job is. And so I think, you know, again, none of this is sort of arguing against unbundling or the centrality of unbundling or the necessity of unbundling. It's to say that there are a lot of other building blocks. If we're going to respond to some of the lessons from the Indian and the Mexican case study, there are some critical building blocks that are missing from the South African story. And a lot of that is about paying attention to some elements of the system that have been kind of largely ignored. And then also, I think, creating some clarity around certain discussions so that we can move forward in a coherent way.
Okay, thanks very much, Lauren. So what I'm going to do now is just finally turn to Matthew Parks, who's been waiting incredibly patiently. And then what I'd really like to do, we've got a few minutes left. So after Matthew's responded, I'll just introduce another couple of the questions that have come through the Q&A function. So hopefully we'll have at least time for at least a couple of responses to some of those, although we'll have to be very brief as we run out of time. So anyway, Matthew, if you'd like to respond to any of the issues, and yeah, sure. The floor is yours.
Okay, thanks, Richard, and hopefully my internet connection is decent enough. So I'm from the Congress of South African Trade Unions. So I think maybe the one thing really missing in today's discussion from colleagues was the issue of jobs. Both the jobs that are at risk at Eskom right now if it can collapse, but also the amount of jobs that we're losing in the manufacturing and mining sectors when Eskom was not able to provide a reliable source of electricity to the economy. But look, in terms of the unbundling issue, to us it really is neither here nor there. Eskom is in a crisis not because it needs to be unbundled or doesn't need to be unbundled. It's in a crisis because we've had a management there for the past decade who have looted it to the point of collapse. We've got billions of rands lost to corruption, to mismanagement. We basically had hooligans running amok at Eskom's management for a decade who have broken it. There's been structural shifts in the energy sector which has taken place whilst Eskom has had its eye off the ball. Eskom has overpriced itself to the point that the mining sector is now going off grid. It has failed to invest in maintenance for a decade plus. It has failed to collect billions of rands from consumers, from municipalities, from departments of government, and has put itself and the country into a debt spiral. That's the issue that needs to be addressed, not the issue of unbundling. That's moving chairs on the Titanic ship. It's irrelevant. I think COVID-19 does give a little bit of breathing space, which Eskom, I think, has done some work to fast-track maintenance to try to minimize load shedding as we re-emerge. But look, for us, as we emerge from the lockdown, the greatest threat, once again, remains a supply of reliable and affordable electricity. It is the greatest obstacle to rebuilding the economy. I think for us, we can't overemphasize the issue of jobs enough. In the gold sector, 62,000 gold jobs lost. No one provided a just transition for those workers. We've got about 72,000 workers in the coal sector. And yes, we need to move away from fossil fuels to renewable energy, but we need to take those workers and those communities with us. So I think for us, it was critical as Eskom to invest in renewable energy as a producer, as an owner, but also for us to start investing, producing local renewable energy technology locally, like solar panels, like wind turbines, etc. So we can create jobs for those workers whose lives are at stake. We can take those communities with us. We can start, once again, we can transform energy sector from a burden to the economy to one that can create jobs for South Africans, one that can export electricity to the continent again. It can be an income earner for us, but we have to have the political will to do it. Business has to come to the party. We have to look at using incentives to make sure it happens, but it has to be well coordinated. So it's fine to have solar panel farms in Northern Cape, that's fantastic. But we have to be a bit more coordinated and have solar panel farms and factories in Mpumalanga where the coal belt is to make sure we take those workers with us. I think for us, Richard, it really is an exciting opportunity where we can exceed our climate change targets, where energy can really become like agriculture, like tourism, a huge income earner, job creator for the economy, but it needs to be coordinated. One other thing, which is a useful crisis facing us, is that Eskom is going to be mothballing many of its power stations in the next few years. It doesn't have money to invest in generation capacity, but there is huge international green funding available for that. But again, it requires a serious just transition to take place for those Eskom workers, for those communities, and for South Africa at large. As Kosato, just lastly, we haven't waited for government to come to the party. We've drafted a Eskom social compact. It's basically finalized at NEDLAC. Government has agreed, business has agreed. It's going to be formally adopted at the Presidential Working Committee on the first Monday of July. We're quite pleased. We've got a new CEO at Eskom who's quite keen to work with us, and we've been quite motivated by his initial steps. And so for us, we're going to get things moving, because, if we wait for government will talk nice English words forever and never do anything. If we wait for business itself won't do it. So I think for us, really, in conclusion, this is an exciting opportunity, but it requires government, business, and labor and communities all to contribute, to compromise, and to sacrifice. But if we do it, it can be a game changer for the economy. If we don't do it, well, then we're in serious trouble. Thanks, Richard.
Okay, thank you very much, Matthew. So from going through the Q&A, I've got a few issues that I just wanted to bring up that people have raised. So one is about kind of the use of the term just transition, which is used very widely, as we've heard many speakers have mentioned it, and whether there's enough of a common definition there that it's really meaningful, or if it's just rhetoric that is kind of, so how serious is the government, and how serious are the current proposals taking the concept of the just transition? The next question is, what about financing? We've heard about the need for bailouts remaining after reform. How can this enormous transition be financed, and how does that? What do the reforms tell us about that? What are the options, and how can cost recovery feeds into that as well? And then the final point that I just wanted to raise was, we heard from Alejandro actually in one of the presentations that there was a risk in Mexico of renewables becoming associated with private energy compared to whereas coal is public energy, and how real do you think that risk is, and what can be done to overcome it? That there may well have been other questions as well. I think the panelists may have been able to browse the Q&A, but if I can just do one more very quick round to see if there's anything you want to pick on or any final thoughts you want to add. So Salim, I'll come back to you first.
Okay, I'm just going to try to respond to the question, one of the questions around the concept of the just transition. And I think that it's fair to say at this point in time, the whole country needs a vision around a just transition, not just in the energy sector, because we not only had massive structural issues in the economy before COVID, but they've gone worse since COVID. And I think Matthew's point about also fixing Eskom and dealing with corruption and sort of rent seeking. Most state enterprises have actually been repurposed for precisely those things. And there's a wider politics of reform in state enterprises that has to be dealt with. But I do think that the energy security issue in the country requires us to be quite deft and flexible while we think about issues with regard to saving Eskom. We also have to open up certainly our minds to more flexible solutions that have to come on board pretty much fast. Whether that has to wait for Eskom's reform or we can fast track it in parallel is something that that has to be thought about quite seriously because we are running out of power very fast.
Okay, thank you very much. Anton, would you like to make any final thoughts and pick up on any of those issues?
Let me pick up on the finance question, and I'm glad that it was raised because this is a huge issue for the sector and for Eskom, and it's still unresolved. And there's really two sides of the coin here. The one is Eskom's massive debt levels, sitting at 480 billion plus, and also our need. So our need to refinance and to sort out that debt, but at the same time, our need to finance new investment. So as I mentioned in my previous contribution, we have a huge need for new capacity. Where's that money going to come from? Eskom has zero ability to raise additional finance on its stressed balance sheet. So, again, it reinforces the importance of creating a transparent and fair platform, the IISMO, as a mechanism for contracting and procuring new finance and new investment in the sector. What do we do about Eskom's debt? It's going to have to be a combination of interventions. There's a huge hole in Eskom's accounts, which I guess can only be dealt with, not only, but would need a contribution from government, an annual contribution. Government's made that commitment of 23 billion a year. this year it's putting 59 billion into Eskom. I mean, without that bailout, Eskom would be insolvent. I don't think there's enough committed to next year. I think it's something like 36 billion. And these issues of refinancing Eskom's debt are going to come up again. We still believe, those of us who were on the President's task team, and I'm pleased to see that the COSATU team have also had similar thoughts, although perhaps with a slightly different color to it, around putting some of this debt into a special purpose vehicle and then refinancing. And then the issues are, what route do you adopt? I think there's some very exciting work being done on a just energy transaction, which would be a blended climate finance facility, which would enable us to refinance Eskom's debt at lower rates, and also create potentially an income stream to help finance the just energy transition.
Thank you, Anton. Lauren, would you like to go next?
Yeah, absolutely. So what I'd like to say is, pertaining to this just transition and whether or not we have a shared definition, what I would say, and picking up on Matthew's comments about taking people with us, is that a just transition can't just be about just outcomes. It has to be about a just process. And that is a transparent process that has high levels of participation and representation from all relevant parts of society. And at the moment, regardless of outcomes, what we do know is that we certainly do not have high enough levels of transparency and participation in the sector. And if we're going to move forward in whatever direction, and we're going to undertake sort of collective sense making and building consensus around certain policy positions, then that needs to be changed immediately. Thanks.
Okay, thank you very much. And Matthew, finally.
Sure, no, thanks. I think, Richard, what you see here is that in South Africa, there's a significant degree of consensus about what needs to be done to Eskom. It is our greatest threat. We had tried to intervene in Eskom partly, as Anton was saying, and we think the PIC has to come to the party. Government and the private sector must all come to the party. It's our greatest national asset, our greatest threat. But also Eskom has to plug the holes. They have to do the restructuring, the reform. They have to be held accountable. On the just transition, I think for us, the key thing is simply to take it from nice English words and ideas into practical projects where energy workers, the families can see it. Because right now they're scared to death. They're scared of losing their jobs in an economy with 40% unemployment. We're also frightened of creating ghost towns as we've done previously. So I think for us, there's huge opportunities. And as Anton has said, Eskom doesn't have a cent to invest in generation, but there is significant international green energy funding available. So let's use it as an opportunity to take South Africans out of unemployment, to reindustrialize our economy. So for us, there's huge opportunities, but if we sleep on a job, there's huge threats as well. Thanks, Richard.
Okay, thank you very much, everyone. And Kay, we are out of time and over time, so I'll just give a very brief couple of kind of key points that I've noted down as we've spoken. So we've heard that utility reform is only one piece of the puzzle. So reforming Eskom is something that many people have spent a lot of time talking about, but broader energy and electricity sector reform is also very important. Unbundling is not the end of the story. It's not going to end demand for bailouts. There's a risk of over-promising what unbundling can and will deliver, although there are some key advantages to unbundling. When you have sectors that aren't solvent, then shocks lead to calls for bailouts, as we heard about from the India case study. We've also heard about how national context really matters in terms of reforms and bringing people with us and building a broad coalition, a few speakers mentioned. We heard of the risk of renewable energy becoming a synonym with private energy and that creating opposition. We also heard about the advantages of having an independent operator for system fairness. We heard about the need for transparency, also in the process of reform. So just transition is not just about outcomes, it's about a just process as well. And finally, the need for a supply of reliable and affordable energy being essential for the economy. And then very finally, I had a point which I liked very much, which was that there's a need for civil society to present evidence and not just advocate for positions. And I think that's a good kind of, hopefully we've contributed in some way to that today, and will certainly try and contribute evidence and not just be advocates for fixed positions going forward. So all that remains is for me to thank very sincerely all the presenters and all the panelists, and most of all the participants. We had around 130 people today, so that was a big success, and there'll be a link to the video online if anyone wants to rewatch any of it and make notes. Also, please do be in touch, and thank you very much again to everyone involved. It was a real pleasure. So see you later, everyone. Bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.